Well, hello all. There are a growing number of Christians who like to keep the Sabbath day, they like to keep holy days, and you have to ask the question, why? Well, why do you keep a 7-day week? Where do you think that came from? It appears to have come directly from Genesis 1 and the days of creation and how God instituted a 7-day week. And there are a lot of people who think, I wouldn't mind giving God one day of the week and should I keep the Sabbath or a Sabbath? Well, what did God say in the beginning? Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, not a Sabbath day. So it seemed to be definite article, a specific Sabbath day. But then one asks oneself, okay, suppose you've got a 7-day week, the weeks go by, how would you know which day is the Sabbath day? Well, when the Israelites came out of captivity from Egypt, probably didn't know which day of the week was which. Manna fell on 6 days of the week, but it did not fall on the Sabbath day, and they were commanded not to collect it on the Sabbath day, because there was none to collect. So, so the Sabbath is a relatively easy calendar question. You just have to look at the Jews to find which is the Sabbath day to keep. And Christ didn't keep a Sabbath day. He kept the Sabbath day on the same day as the Jews were keeping, and as did all the apostles and the whole early church met on the Sabbath day. And it says Christ, as his custom was, went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and did all kinds of things. And he was well known for being on the Sabbath day and reading in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. So you could say keeping a Sabbath is actually a Christian tradition. Christ kept it. Was Christ a Christian? Well, is the Pope a Catholic? Christ was the ultimate Christian, and all his disciples kept the Sabbath day. And then we see significant events occurring on the Jewish holidays. For example, Pentecost is, well, Passover is a specific, very important Jewish holiday, and Christ died on Pentecost. Remember, on Passover. Passover and Pentecost are, for example, Jewish holidays. Christ kept the Passover, so there we have another example of a Christian, the ultimate Christian, Christ, and all the disciples keeping the Passover. Many times the Lord's Supper is called the Passover in all Gospels, so that he kept the Passover. But the strange thing is, the Jews were keeping the Passover one day after Christ kept the Passover. And the day that Christ was crucified on was actually a Passover day. The Passover starts in the evening with a meal, and it continues through the next day as a Sabbath day. So the Christ and the disciples were actually keeping Passover a day before the Jews kept Passover, which leads you to think, who's right, Christ or the Jews? Christ or the Jews? Is that a hard question? Well, no. Christ is always right compared to the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You in vain, it says something about teaching the traditions of men. So the Pharisees were very into their traditions and whatever. And the Jewish calendar, people have spent a lot of time studying it. I'm an amateur Jewish calendar studier, but I do know that the Jewish calendar was supposed to start in around the month after the first full moon after the equinox is when Passover was supposed to fall. But it was also supposed to be determined by the crops in the field, because you were supposed to go into the fields, and you were supposed to be able to, of the barley, which was the first crop, you were supposed to get this bowl or omer full of barley, and you were supposed to rub it with your hands, get a bowl of this crop, and then on the morrow after the Passover Sabbath, but in fact it's the Passover Sabbath morning, you were supposed to raise this bowl and show it before the Lord. So it was supposed to be all God's feasts were supposed to be determined by the crops in the fields. They were supposed to be celebrations of how God had blessed the Israelites in the land of Israel. So you weren't supposed to, like the Jews currently have, a system of it was mathematically worked out in around 350 AD, all the holy days from now on, or from then on, were more or less set in place, and then they have certain rules that the holy days can't fall on certain days. None of these rules occur in the Bible. The Bible's very silent on all these, what they call postponements of the holy days. So that's again a tradition of the Jews, to postpone a holy day if it occurs on the day, like a Friday before the Sabbath. So they don't like that, because how can you prepare for the Sabbath if you've got, say, a Passover holy day on a Friday before the Sabbath on a Saturday? So then they postpone, and they've got all these many postponements. So the Jewish holy days can only occur, according to the Jews' tradition, only occur on certain days of the week. So that kind of explains why Christ kept a Passover, the Passover, and I believe he kept it on the true date, and the Jews kept it one day later. Now, this is all very interesting, even to Christians, because if you go back to Leviticus 23, it says, "And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts." So we talk about these holy days, which some modern Christians want to keep, for the reason that Christ and the disciples kept them. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest and holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Okay, so many Christians like to keep the Sabbath. These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread. Unto the Lord 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. Now, to determine when the year starts, you had to have a crop in the field, a grain crop. And I'm skipping along to Leviticus 23:11 or 10. "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you come into the land which I shall give unto you, and you shall reap the harvest thereof, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. And you shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." Now, the reason why you had to do this was there had to be a crop in the field. If there wasn't a crop, you postponed the month to the next month. If the crop was too young to rub out, not a sheaf, it's actually an omer, it's a bowl, it's a liquid measure of the grain, which is normally the barley, the first harvest. You had to rub out this bowl full, and if you could get a bowl full easily by just rubbing it with your hands, then you would proclaim, okay, this now is going to be the first month of the year, and this is going to be your first holy day of the year. And you would see the crops in the field, you would see that the grains are big enough to harvest, and you would say, okay, this is the official way that you would proclaim that this is the start of the Passover holy day season. This has nothing to do with mathematics. This is going into the field, looking at the grain in the Holy Land and saying, yes, there's enough. The grain is ripe enough that the grains will fall out if we rub them in our hand, and we can get an omer's worth of this stuff quite easily. And what is so interesting is, although this looks like Leviticus 23:11 looks like a very Old Testament thing, but it's got huge New Testament significance, because that wave sheaf pictures Christ. Christ was the first of the first fruit. So you've got this first fruit harvest, which is normally the barley crop. And the very first of it, the first bowl, represents Christ. He was rubbed, he was punished, he was lifted off the ground. You know, the grains have to be, the sheaf has to be lifted from the earth, separated from the earth. So now you have this bowl of the first fruit, which represents Christ, and it's way before the Lord. Christ was came before the Lord and was an acceptable offering to the Lord. So this pictures the lifting up of Christ. And when he's lifted up, it says that a grain cannot live unless it dies first. So he died in being lifted up and nailed to the cross. And then by his death came, you could say, the little grains could fall to the ground and you would get life. So he talked about how a grain has to be planted in the ground before it can grow again and give life. So it has to die first before it can give life. This is all symbolic of Christ. This omer's worth, the punishing of the wheat, of the barley harvest to get the grain out, is the punishing of Christ. The lifting up of this bowl is the lifting up of Christ on the cross. The waving of this, the rubbing of the grain, that is the torturing of Christ. The waving of it before the Lord, or showing it to the Lord, is to the Lord, the Father, considered this as an acceptable offering. And what is also so interesting is that all of this pictured the death of Christ, and it occurred on exactly the right time. Because if Christ kept the Passover on the correct day, on the morrow after the Passover, Christ was lifted up at 9 o'clock in the morning, which is when the sheaf, when the omer was supposed to be rubbed out. And he was punished, he was lifted up on the cross, and he died just as the wheat or the grain, the barley harvest, the barley grains would be separated. They would have no more their life support. And this occurred on the morning after the Passover. Just have a look at Leviticus 23 verse 11. And you shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you on the morrow. Now, after is not in the Hebrew. There's absolutely no after. On the morrow, the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And this, the Jews say, is the day after Passover Sabbath, but it's actually the morrow of the Passover. And that is what Christ did. He ate the Passover in the evening, and on the morning of the Passover, he was lifted up, punished and lifted up and died. And so you can clearly see the symbolism of Christ in this wave sheaf. And then what's interesting is from this particular getting of the omer, which occurs at 9 a.m., you're supposed to count 50 days to Pentecost. And that the count begins when the omer is reaped and waved before the Lord. And then if you carry on and read Leviticus 23, verse 12, 23:15, and you shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, or not the morrow after the Sabbath, but the Sabbath morrow, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete, even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall you number 50 days, and you shall offer a new meat offering unto the Lord. So this is now counting to Pentecost. This is what we call the Pentecost count. But again, there's no after. You shall even to the morrow of the 7th Sabbath shall you number 50 days. Pentecost means count 50. So this is how you count to Pentecost. But what is so interesting for Christians is that the count of Pentecost began, if you like, with the crucifixion of Christ, and Pentecost was when the Holy Spirit was given, and that too has got great significance. It was a Jewish holiday, but it was also a Christian holiday, because that's the day on which the Holy Spirit fell on the 120. But now think about this. If there's no after this, even until the morrow of the 7th Sabbath, it shouldn't be after the 7th Sabbath. It's on the Sabbath, not after the Sabbath. It's on the Sabbath that Pentecost was fully come. If you read Acts 2, it says that Pentecost was fully come, the 3rd hour, 9 o'clock in the morning, the same time that Christ was crucified. 7 weeks later, Pentecost arrived, and the Holy Spirit was given at the exact time that Christ was lifted up onto the cross. And it was on a Sabbath day, on the day of Pentecost, a Sabbath day, the Sabbath morning of Pentecost. Pentecost is a Sabbath day, that the Holy Spirit was given to the 120. And again, what's so interesting is the Jews were coming to Jerusalem to keep Pentecost from all around the world, but they were not in the temple. These were Jews that had arrived in Jerusalem to keep Pentecost. They were again a day late to keep Pentecost. And so people come running when the Holy Spirit falls on the 120. They come running to the 120, and 3,000 are converted that day. And then what is so interesting is that in Acts 2, it says that from then on they continued in the temple with the 3,000 and the 120. Why in the temple? Because when Pentecost occurred, the people were not as they would normally be doing. That'd be the hour of prayer in the temple. They were actually in a room by themselves when the Holy Spirit fell, a day before the Jews were keeping Pentecost. So the Jews were keeping Pentecost again, like Passover, a day too late. And so they were one day out with this count, and so the Holy Spirit was given to the Christians first, the people that were waiting in the room for the Holy Spirit. They were waiting there. Christ had instructed them to be in Jerusalem and wait, and they were expecting something, but they didn't know what, and then the Holy Spirit was given. And then the 3,000 are converted on that same day by the sermon that Peter preaches, and then they continue in the temple, because that would be the normal place to keep Shavuot or Pentecost. So from then on, obviously the room is too small, but that is the normal time that you would be keeping Pentecost, and the normal place. If you were in Jerusalem, and you would go to the hour of prayer at 9 o'clock in the morning, and that's where the disciples and the newly converted 3,000, they all went to the temple, as Acts 2 says. Let's just see if I can find that for you. And then in Acts 2 verse 46 says, and they continued daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house to eat their meat. So on the next day after the Holy Spirit is given is when the Jews were keeping it, their Pentecost in the temple, or their Shavuot, I think they call it. And so there's the mention of the temple, but no temple in the original when the Holy Spirit falls on them. So it's all just so interesting how these Passover and Pentecost are all linked to Christians. Passover, obviously Christ was killed on Passover. Pentecost, the Holy Spirit was given on Pentecost. The early church started on Pentecost with the 3,000 and the 120. And so many Christians these days think it's well worth keeping these days, as why not? God commanded them in the Old Testament. Many of the early believers were Jews. They continued with their traditions. They had no reason to stop it. They could just see the added significance of what these days mean, and they didn't mind giving God 1/7 of their time, one day a week, to spend with God. So to wrap this up, what is wrong with the Jewish calendar today? Well, if you were, say, a Christian, and you'd plan to keep the Christian/Jewish holy days mentioned in the Old Testament, and you wanted to keep Passover and you wanted to keep Pentecost, you want to know on which days to keep them. Now, if you're going to look at if you're going to keep it just the way the Jewish traditions say, you would find that in this year, 2024, they have postponed Passover from, instead of being the first full moon after the equinox, which this year is on the night of the 25th, day of the 26th of March, they've postponed it because they consider this a leap year, and they've postponed it till April. But that's just how it was worked out mathematically in 350 or so AD by a Jewish committee. And now that the Jews are back in the promised land, what they should do is follow the ruling in Leviticus 23, and that is they should go and look at their crops in the field, and if the barley crop is ripe enough to get an omer's worth that they can rub out with their hands, then that should be what determines whether it's a leap year or not. So what is quite interesting is people who believe the same way as I do actually go and inspect the current barley crop in Israel, and you should do a YouTube search of Deborah's date tree. I'll give the link in the description or in the comment section. And when she inspected in field 5, if you go from time 18 minutes to 23, you'll see there is a field in the Jordan Valley with barley that is ready to harvest. They call it Aviv or Abib, which is the name of the first month when the harvest is ready. So it's already determined when she did this on the 7th of March that the some of the barley crop is ready to harvest, some is not, but it doesn't matter. All you need to get is 1 omer or bowl's worth. So definitely you can't just leave the crop in the field for a month. It has to be harvested. So the sooner you do it, the better. And if there's one field where the harvest is ripe, then it's Aviv or Abib, and it's time for the harvest. And there's no need. It's not right to postpone the year and make it a leap year, or postpone the month, should I say, and have Passover in April instead of now, when the barley is actually already harvestable, and there's at least an omer's worth in some fields, or in this particular field 5 in the Jordan Valley. So that just is interesting. Go and check it out. So you can't just rely on the Jewish calendar with all its postponements and its traditions and its let's push the day forward because we don't want it interfering with the Sabbath, and we can only have holy days on these days. I mean, why follow those Jewish traditions? They're completely wrong. And now they are back in the land. They have the opportunity to follow it exactly by determining the beginning of the year by the fact that there is a ripe crop in the field. And the crops were always supposed to be the determiner of whether it's the start of the Jewish holy day calendar year or not. So if there's a crop in the field that's ripe, then the year must begin. You can't just have a leap year whenever it suits you because you've worked it out mathematically. So that's a big problem. So I tend to say that what one should rather do is just keep it as is the normal way, which is the first full moon after the equinox. And how easy is that to determine? And then you don't need all the complications of the Jewish calendar. So the 15th is the night of the full moon, and you just look for when the full moon rises after sunset for the first time, and that is the night of the full moon to keep the Passover in 2024, and that happens to be the night of the 25th, and the day of the 26th is the Passover Sabbath day.